So it's possible we could see something in the next few weeks of a move by the Russians to try and retake some of the territory they've lost. Um, but overall, I think we're in a fairly static position. I honestly don't think this thing is going to come to a conclusion anytime soon. It's difficult to see anybody deciding to negotiate about anything at this stage. So I think we're in for a fairly long period of relative, I stress, calm before the spring.
It's time for our daily briefing room. This is where we get joined by one of our leading tactical and strategic minds, someone with years of experience at the highest level of military command, will share their insights with us on the current state of the war in Ukraine. Today, delighted to be joined by Tim Cross, who is a retired British Army officer and military logistics expert. Tim, thank you for joining us.
Very welcome. Nice to talk to you.
Would you start by giving us, I suppose, a broad overview of the latest situation in Ukraine?
Yeah, I don't think much has changed really in the last few weeks. Clearly, from a ground offensive point of view, the winter weather has curtailed offensive operations, and the lines are. I mean, obviously, tactically, day to day, there's fighting, serious fighting going on in one sense, but on a broader operational level, there's not been much change. The Russians, of course, continue to hit Ukraine from the air, particularly with drone and rocket attacks and so forth. And they continue to target the infrastructure, particularly the energy infrastructure. And, that's doing serious damage. There's no point in denying that. But nonetheless, it's not breaking the Ukrainian will to resist. And if anything, I think it's hardening that. From a Ukrainian point of view, they've been able to hit fairly deep into Russian territory using their own drones and so on. And that's been quite an interesting development because it's relatively new. And I think it's something that they're probably going to continue with. Um, in terms of opening up a ground offensive, I think the Russians are probably looking to do that before the spring. And I don't think the Ukrainians will be ready for a major ground offensive much before the spring. So it's possible we could see something in the next few weeks of a move by the Russians to try and retake some of the territory they've lost. Um, but overall, I think we're in a fairly static position. I honestly don't think this thing is going to come to a conclusion anytime soon. It's difficult to see anybody deciding to negotiate about anything at this stage. So I think we're in for a fairly long period of relative, I stress, calm before the spring.
You mentioned drones there. I've read a few reports involving drones recently, and I'm sort of struggling to get a sense of how significant the role that drones are playing in this conflict is, and also who's winning on that particular front.
Yeah. Well, drones. I have to. I have to say, back in 1982, I did my master's degree on guided weapons, and I talked about unmanned aerial vehicles back then. But they really were very slow in making any real impression from a battlefield point of view until Ukraine. Really, I mean, this development has been very rapid. They are making a serious difference. The Russians are basically fighting an unmanned aerial campaign. They seem very reluctant to use their manned aircraft. And in terms of delivering the numbers, they are in the ascendancy. Now, that said, the Ukrainians are shooting down a lot of drones. I mean, something like, it's difficult to know the exact figures, obviously, but something like 85% of the Russian drone attack, the drones are actually being shot down using good air defense systems that the Ukrainians have been given from the West. And they've been given some more, like Patriot and so on. Um, their use of drones has been quite interesting. They've been using them tactically on the ground to defeat Russian armor and ground offensive targets. But more recently, as I say, they've used them to go deep into Russian territory and take on airfields. And that's been quite a significant change. Who's winning? I wouldn't say one or other is winning. I think the Ukrainians are making good, effective use of their drones and are putting the Russians on the back foot, from a sort of more strategic point of view. But the Russians are definitely causing a lot of damage with their drones. And even when you shoot a drone down, of course, it still falls to the ground along with a missile that you use to shoot it down. So it causes damage and often casualties with it. So the move to drone warfare, unmanned aerial warfare, is a significant part of this campaign. And there's no doubt that it has got a lot of people thinking about, what future campaigns and warfare will look like in terms of AI and other, modern technology, if you like.
You mentioned that you can't see this conflict coming to a resolution anytime soon. What would be your best assessment of how things develop over the next few months?
I think this is going to drag on a long time. I can't see Putin pulling away from this. I know there's lots of talk about his health and internal problems in Russia, but I don't think in the great scheme of things, I don't think they're significant. I can't see President Zelensky or the Ukrainians being prepared to hold and go to negotiate in the situation that they're in. They're going to want to try and regain some more of their lost territory. Um, so my own instinct, to be absolutely honest, is I think this is going to continue well into next year, and could well go on beyond the summer. It's not a very nice prognosis in one sense, but it is difficult to see. I mean, if the Russians were able to put together, they've mobilized. I mean, we all know they've mobilized quite a large number of troops, but they're pretty badly, very badly trained and equipped. If they were able to mobilize another 100,000, 150,000, and start a major air campaign, then it's possible that they could break through. They still seem to be intent on securing the four provinces, but also maybe taking Odessa and securing the northern flank of the Black Sea. So I don't think those intentions have gone away. I mean, Putin is clearly not done as well, anywhere near as well as he would have wanted. But I just can't see him walking away from this, is the truth.
You mentioned those mobilisations. Could we expect to see more of a Russian ground offensive, or is this very much becoming an air battle?
Ultimately, it will have to include a ground offensive. You don't win. They're not. Nobody's going to win this through just using drones or air assets. So I think, as I said earlier, I think the Russians are probably going to be in a better position to conduct a new ground offensive, maybe within the next few weeks, couple of months. I don't think the Ukrainians are going to be ready for until the spring. So I think ultimately there will be more of a major ground offensive sometime, in the next 2 to 3 months. How that pans out, of course, nobody knows. The key issue, or one of the key issues, is the determination of the West to continue to support Ukraine in this fight. And President Zelensky is clearly very concerned about that, and I think he's right to be concerned, because this is obviously causing, a lot of hardship, and it's costing a lot of money and so on. So that's his key issue. But I think the West will hold firm unless there's a really, really difficult patch, cold weather or whatever, that drives energy prices back up. But I think the West will hold firm, and that's the key issue from ensuring that Zelensky doesn't fail. But what do we mean by success for the Ukrainians? Are they really going to be capable of retaking all the lost territory in the short term? Frankly, I doubt it.
I was actually just going to ask you about the role of the West there. Some optimism in terms of the West's ability to keep supporting Ukraine, but we obviously saw President Zelensky in the United States recently, and there was some talk that the reason he was there was trying to shore up support because, of course, we are seeing the Republican Party start to get slight cold feet about support for Ukraine. Do you get the sense that the US is going to remain fully committed to this fight, or is that perhaps maybe one of the first weak links in this Western chain that has so far been fairly strong in its defence of Ukraine?
I think potentially it is an issue. The Americans are more focused on China and the Far East overall, strategically, where they see that as a long-term threat. I mean, you may have heard this expression before, but somebody once said to me not that long ago that Russia is bad weather. China is the equivalent of global climate change. It is the long-term strategic threat. And there's no doubt in my mind that that's where the main American focus is. And, as a result of COVID and what's been going on in China and so on, there are concerns that President Xi is going to stir up a bit of trouble. Obviously, Taiwan is one of those issues. Now, there has been pressure in America for President Biden to reduce the amount of aid going over to Ukraine. And there's no doubt that President Zelensky went to the States in order to try and, solidify their support. And I think in the short term, he's probably succeeded in that. But it is costing the US quite a lot of money. And public support in America is not that strong. It's pretty strong in the UK, but it's not that strong elsewhere in Europe either. So I think, as I said earlier, this is Zelensky's number one issue. He's got to keep the pressure on for the West to sustain. Will America crack in the short term? I don't think so. But if this thing drags on for a long time, then the pressure for Zelensky to enter negotiations to try to bring this thing to an end in some shape or form, I think is bound to increase.
Tim Cross, thank you very much for joining us. Tim is a retired British Army officer and military logistics expert.